We are already on track to borrow another $20 trillion over the next decade. We are going to be hitting record levels of debt as a share of the economy in just a few years. Interest payments are growing faster than anything in the budget. They are the single largest item in the budget. The fiscal situation is really bad. Part of what got there, obviously some of what got there was emergencies like COVID, where we should have borrowed. But a big component was that a lot of policies have not been offset in recent years. One of those big ones was the Trump tax cuts. They added $2 trillion to the debt. Many members of Congress were saying, we made a mistake. We should have, and these are the Republicans who supported that, we should have also cut spending. We didn't do that in order to keep this from adding to the debt. But now, if you are talking about really extending these tax cuts, again, the portions that are expiring, we are talking about even larger a price tag, upwards of $4 trillion. And then there are other things they are talking about, including some of the business tax cuts that have expired, could bring you up to $5 trillion. There is absolutely no space in our very dangerous fiscal situation right now to be talking about adding trillions more. And so you just can't talk about this without thinking about how you're going to offset those costs and that lost revenue.
Well, this is really interesting. And this is something that people need to hear, because the argument, Maya, is the tax cuts aren't the problem. The spending is. And we simply need to rein in spending or somehow refigure entitlements like Social Security and Medicare to get through this. But you and I both know that's not about to happen. And neither of the men who are on the verge of becoming president, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, say they're going to touch the entitlements.
I mean, that's right. I have no problem with the argument. One can be for big government or small government, and they can be fiscally responsible or fiscally reckless, either way. But it is absolutely correct to say that our spending is growing at a massive clip. We're going to have huge amounts of growth in healthcare, retirement, and interest over the coming decades. Defense spending is also likely to increase because there are many more threats around the world. The problem is the people making those arguments then turn around and vote for spending increases. And if you look at what happened under President Trump's tenure, he cut taxes, but he raised spending massively every time they increased the debt ceiling. Whereas most recently, the debt ceiling had a package that helped to reduce borrowing. Every time under President Trump, they actually added more spending to the overall budget and more borrowing. So you can't talk about the importance of cutting spending while you're casting votes to increase spending, just like most of the people who've taken a no new tax pledge also at the same time have voted to increase spending. About 90% of them have. So the hypocrisy in budget run large, run on all sides, but it's really what's gotten us into this mess of huge, huge mountains of debt and more to come if we don't make changes.
Well, how important is this to the people who are in the room at the Business Roundtable today, Maya? You interact with a lot of them. You know, you don't hear a lot about deficits and debt in a campaign cycle when everybody's trying to grab the brass ring here. And you know there's going to be a big drive to increase Pentagon spending if there's another Trump presidency. And that'll probably happen under a Biden second term if there is one here. So what do the executives in that room think about this? Are they as worried as you are?
So my experience with the business leaders is they are very worried about the national debt, but they probably, many of them will put having tax cuts over the concerns about the debt. So we've seen that, I mean, in the past, CEOs were some of the best advocates for getting our fiscal situation under control, but I think they actually got frustrated because Washington was unable to implement those changes. And so they've turned their attention more towards the tax regime, the regulatory regime. I think they would support, and I'm generalizing, they all have different points of view. Many of them would support those spending cuts that go along with tax cuts. But again, as we've just said, there seems to be no political appetite for that. And the problem is we now have two people running for president competing on giveaways. Who can give more in tax cuts and to which group, and who can increase spending more, and who can protect Social Security and Medicare, which, by the way, are heading towards insolvency. Protecting them means across the board cuts in those programs for recipients and providers. That is a terrible promise to today's seniors and people who will depend on the programs. And yet that's what our politicians are promising. There's very little talk of fiscal responsibility. And I'm sure any CEO who somebody asked, do you think the debt should be lower than it is? They would say yes, because there's no way you can look at this trajectory and think that things are okay. We are in grave, grave danger of weakening our economy and our national security if we don't find a way to bring our borrowing trajectory down.
We're speaking some hard truths here with Maya MacGuineas from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Spent the day yesterday, Maya, talking about inflation, and everyone cheered this CPI showing prices going up at a slower rate than some expected, still rising. However, depending on the metric you look at here, the Federal Reserve is higher for longer. What is the impact of ballooning deficits on this very thing, the issue that's driving voters in November, the issue of inflation?
That's right. So inflation is having a huge impact on how people feel about the economy. Clearly, we got to this inflationary moment for a number of factors: supply chains, oil, and one of those factors was excessive fiscal stimulus. At the end of COVID, we put more money in the economy than we should have, and that kicked off inflation. It's turned out that it's been difficult to get control of. The problem that politicians, all of whom want to help alleviate inflation, that they don't recognize is that all the borrowing they're engaging in now makes inflation worse, not better. If you want to help inflation, you need to bring your borrowing down so you are not overstimulating the economy.